So Woody Shticks, thanks for joining me.
My gracious, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh, good. Yeah. So I really kind of fell in love with your work when I saw you at the Come Inside theater festival. I had a play reading there, and then I kind of got to see other shit, and yours was some of that shit, and it was really amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I was so excited to see that you were part of that festival because you and I met briefly a couple months before at a body storytelling event, and your story rocked my world.
Oh, thank you.
I
That's very
think
sweet
about
of you to say.
howling every other day.
That's so funny because I had a whole bit that I forgot. I usually am pretty good at memorization, but I forgot this whole chunk of my story, and I
Yeah.
left stage feeling like I nailed it, and at the same time, I didn't nail it as much as I should, and that kind of performer
Mm-hmm.
brain of like
Mm-hmm.
nobody in the audience noticed that I forgot something, but I know, so I was feeling all insecure
Oh,
afterwards. But
I totally understand. I didn't notice a thing.
oh,
It rocked
that's
my
sweet.
world, and I think about it a lot.
Oh, thanks. It's actually funny because I remember there was a part in Swan Song where you were performing, and I don't remember if you lost your place or you did something where you're just kind of like, nope, we're going to do that bit again. And I was so impressed with your just kind of candor and your grace about like, nope, that's not going how I want it to go. So I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna start again and do it the way I want to, which was just such a commanding kind of thing for a performer to do. You very
Mm.
much were like in control of the scene, which I really appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been a performer my whole life, and solo work is something that came to me a little bit later. So
Mm.
I really believe that that's one of the many points of power in being a solo performer of any variety, whether you're a poet or a storyteller or an actor or a comedian. You really do get to kind of control the space and
Mm.
bring people into that, and you really do get to decide how things go and roll with a lot of different punches, but also create the kind of environment that you want to be in.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your upbringing in performance. Like, how did you find your way onto the stage?
Well, I grew up a professional ballet dancer.
Mm.
I saw my first ballet when I was 4 years old, and it kind of rocked my world. And
Wow.
then promptly, and I'm sure with a lot of panache, convinced my parents to enroll me in classes. And then shortly after, I auditioned for a company and was accepted. So I was part of a ballet company for almost 10 years growing up. So I was in class regularly, several times a week, and then would perform with the company throughout the year. But specifically, Nutcracker was our big, like most regional ballet companies, Nutcracker is kind of your
Sure.
your your big event. And for
Mm-hmm.
our particular company, we were an international company, so the main core of adult dancers were from all over the world and would live at this facility, basically our school. And then
Mm.
we would start rehearsals in August. So it was a really intensive, kind of all encompassing approach to the show. So every year for many years, it was kind of my life from August to January. And
Oh,
I
wow.
really fell in love with the Nutcracker itself, but also just the concept of professional performance and
Mm-hmm.
not just being on stage, but knowing that you're on stage with a team of people who are committed to excellence, right? And excellence is a sliding scale, of course, but being being on a stage with people that were industrious and committed and thoughtful about presenting the best work they possibly could, and
Mm-hmm.
that I think more than anything captured me as a little person. I loved
Mm-hmm.
dancing and I love ballet, and I can't do it anymore, but I what really I think spiced me at that time in my life was the dedication and the commitment that I experienced with the other members of that company.
Sure. So did you like start out as a mouse and work your way up? Is that is that the
Oh yeah.
traditional?
Oh yeah. That's kind of the track, yeah. I think most we always called it party scene and battle soldier. That was always
Mm.
like the two things that you do together, it's like most kids are working like in that opening party scene, which is way longer than you think it is.
Oh
And
yeah.
then that battle scene, where you're the little tin soldiers. So that's like most typically what me and my peer group were working on. And then as you can imagine, male identified ballet dancers, especially young ones, are kind of a premium. So
Sure.
pretty quickly, I kind of started taking on other roles in the second act, if you know that show at all, the
Yeah, I actually
ballet.
just worked on that show myself. I was running
Oh,
a skill bag
nice.
on the fly system at our theater. So
Yeah, that's the way. Every
Mhm.
every good production of Nutcracker, I think, has like some kind of plastic snow falling from the ceiling.
Yep. Oh yeah.
It's very essential.
Mhm.
And always exciting, regardless of how old you are when you're working on that show. It's like it truly takes my breath away, and I cry every time. And now,
Yeah.
being a professional house manager and production manager, I run the shows for a lot of different Nutcrackers and cry every
Mhm.
time, of course. But yeah, I just kind of like, rose through the ranks, quite literally, of the tin soldiers for a while. And
Mhm.
then when I was around 10, I started performing. Our company had basically a child prince in the second act.
Hmm.
Some companies have an adult prince, but for us, we had a child prince who kind of accompanied Clara. And then the Sugar Plum Fairy had her own cavalier who was kind of like mirrored of my role. So around
That's
10,
really
I started
nice.
performing that act, and this was, and we'll get into it, but to me, the concept of talking about how art intersects with sexuality is like, de facto, I'm like,
Mhm.
art has always intersected sexuality for me, and now in the work that I make, that's kind of the point.
Mhm.
But I think that was one of the first times that I became hyper aware of my own body in a sexual way, was
Mm.
like performing that role, because as a 10-year-old, I had to switch from black tights in every other scene to white tights in that act. And I became so incredibly self-conscious about the bulge in the front of my tights.
Sure.
I really obsessed about that idea. And my poor parents, I like made them buy so many pairs of tights. I wore like 6 pairs of tights, which is way too many tights. I think I was trying to avoid any sight of my dance belt underneath.
Okay,
It was
yeah.
like a very convoluted set of emotional barriers that I was trying to set up. But I was
Mhm.
still like excited to perform the role. But that was one of the first times that I ever like felt my body on stage and was nervous about it. And then kind of
Mhm.
related that to my sexuality on stage, and like, oh, if somebody like sees the outline of my penis, they're going to think this, that, or the other thing about me. I should also
Yeah.
preface that I grew up in a closed religious community, like Crazy Town. So
Mm.
I was part of a hyper conservative Puritan fundamental church. And I was really the only person I knew, because I went to a crazy Christian school and then a really destructive church as well that kind of ran the school. It was a closed cycle. So
Mm.
I was really the only person I knew that was doing anything outside of the church or Sunday school or youth group. So I already kind of was excited to feel like an outsider. I'm a lone wolf. So that has always suited me.
Mm.
But that was the first time that I ever felt really kind of alone in this process of figuring out my body in a public sense.
Sure. It's interesting
Yeah.
too. How are you? I mean, allowed based on what you are sharing with me about the religious family to even do that kind of performance? That seems like that might be a contradiction.
Absolutely it was. Yeah, I am my nuclear family was really really wacky, and
Mhm.
our home base in our actual home was a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more normal. My mom worked outside of the home. She was one of the only women in our church to do so.
Mm.
My dad's kind of an asshole, which is like a whole nother story, and you heard a part of that in Schlong Song.
I
um,
did, yeah.
but even so, we still grew up with kind of this like nuclear idea. I have older siblings who never went to church.
Mm.
And it really, like, when I came along and then my two younger sisters, it was like my parents suddenly decided to become religious, which really
Mm.
hadn't been a part. They had grown up like pretty Catholic, which is typical for Irish people from New York.
Mhm.
So it kind of moved for my parents from like a kind of a casual cultural identity as a family into this really specific, we're going to make a choice to be hyper religious people. And so that
Mhm.
didn't really come about until I was a kid. And so they were kind of figuring that out. My parents still had a lot on their plate. My dad was an abuser of a variety of sorts. So, like, my parents were constantly dealing with that. So I had a lot of room to kind of do normal things because I think my parents saw the value in that. So, like, my
Mm.
sisters and I had public school friends. We knew women who worked. We were raised essentially by my mom's nursing friends. And I think if you have any access to healthcare families when you're growing up, you'll totally
Mm.
understand that idea. Like, oh yeah, everybody's working night shift. We're
Mhm.
staying over this house because my mom's at the hospital or whatever.
Mhm.
So I'm thankful that through like a really wacky backdoor, I was still able to access some really cool things that other people in my school and my church were definitely not um, able to access, but also not interested in accessing. There was it wasn't even sly. It was a very overt judgment of the idea of dance in general, specifically
Mm.
ballet, because of the physical contact between the dancers, because of the
Mhm.
outfits that people were wearing, which again is like, if you know anything about ballet, you'll know it's like a highly stifled environment. with
Mhm.
exceptions. But I'm like, of all the art forms to really target, this is the one you're targeting. And it's purely
Mhm.
because of like the presentation of a dancer in tights, which is so absurd.
Yeah,
So
well, I
yeah,
mean,
it
but it
was
is
a
about, yeah, it's a neutered environment, but at the same time, it is a hypersexual one because you are looking at just kind of these extraordinary displays of physical prowess. So
right,
it's kind of creates this
right.
weird dissonance.
Absolutely. And you're in this environment where, every ballet is about sex and power, as is
Mhm.
everything, but especially ballet. It's like it's similar to opera in that way, where it's a high
Mhm.
stakes environment. Everything's related to love and death and passion. So I grew up with this like highly inflated sense of stakes, which I can't shake. That's kind of my thing.
Mhm.
So everything is the stakes are so high on everything. And I also grew up around a lot of older men, male identified people, and a lot of gay men, which was really unheard of in Atlantic City. I'm from Atlantic City. So
Mm.
being a hyper urban environment, but also a very poor environment, there was
Mhm.
a constant clash. Like there was no, um, to my eyes, there was no rainbow community. There was no queer community. There was no gay community to speak of. I
Mhm.
think Atlantic City had one gay bar that closed shortly after I moved out of Atlantic
Mm.
City. So, I think that's changing now. The other day, my roommate and I got into an internet hole of like all the things that are happening in AC. But
Yeah, I actually had a friend who went
growing
to a
up,
sex party there, and I'm like, "Wait, a
ah,
sex party in Atlantic City? What?"
wow. I would be
Yeah.
very curious to attend one of those, mostly to hopefully run into some people from my childhood. Um, it was such an odd confluence, but being around a lot of like teenage and older professional dancers gave me access to like this kind of like very particular form of male sexuality, but gay male sexuality that I definitely wouldn't have accessed otherwise.
Mhm.
That wasn't coming to me at school or church or, even in my education. My mom is pretty cool, but also like had her own shit to deal with. So she wasn't necessarily like invested in fostering my sexuality because that was a hard thing for her for a long time. So,
Yeah.
being around these one of my most vivid memories talking about like sex and art put together, but we were in the dressing room and like we all kind of shared a dressing room, and the older guys in the company had this ridiculous song that they would just sing about like playing with balls or something completely innocuous and just like totally like young men in a dressing room song, and it blew my mind as like a 10-year-old. I was like, oh my god, they're talking about their balls, which was like already, it was both erotic but also eye-opening, that I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this can be fun. You can like talk about sex and your body and other people like with levity and with
Yeah,
excitement and with like a casual shame-free uh flavor to it, which again was
sure.
not what I was receiving otherwise.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I was a theater kid growing up, and I remember even in high school, like we would just change together, and we would sing the songs about naked time. And some of us were dating. I mean, this was like middle school, high school. Some of us were dating. Some of us were sexually active, but it just seemed like it created this kind of pan gender, just friend group where it
Yeah.
wasn't that dramatic. And I think that really did help me kind of find a comfort in my sexuality as I got
Mhm.
older, because it was just okay to be bawdy and fun. It was okay to cuddle with people without it being a
Mhm.
sexual thing, even as teenagers. Like it created a safe place to explore sexuality through some cheekiness, through some fun, through some kind of flirtation, but never necessarily about you're giving me a signal and now we're going in this direction. Like there wasn't that segregation of sexuality, there wasn't that segregation by gender. You all just were theater kids. Like that was our gender identity, was theater kid.
Right,
And
right.
it created a nice space for gentle exploration.
Yes, that is so well put, and such a key component of engaging with any kind of like group activity as a young person and growing into adolescence and adulthood, but specifically the arts. I think it's such it's exactly what you said. It's
Mm-hmm.
a melting pot of experience and libido and hormones just thrown all together, and people are really, it's peer to peer education in kind of its like most simple form.
Mm-hmm.
And now, even as a grown up and a professional artist, I still find that in every setting I'm working collaboratively. There is like
Mm-hmm.
so much peer to peer education, and it kind of always drifts back to somehow sex or identity or gender or bodies, or, you're always kind of coming back to that, because I think for
Mm-hmm.
so many of us art kids, right, that's always been a primary function. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, like the first person that I ever had intimate contact with was a director of a show that I was working on when I was 17 at
Mhm.
a community theater. He was,
Mhm.
and I was like in the show, and he was the director, and he was significantly older, or now it's not so significant to me, but at the time it was.
Mhm.
Um, and we had a really positive, consensual, eye-opening relationship for 6 months, secretly, of course. But
Wow.
I kind of, all of my access points to sex are kind of through the arts.
Interesting. Wow,
Yeah.
that's so I mean, when you I guess like maybe I kind of want to ask you about like your transition from being a dancer into other forms of performance. Like what was that decision making process for you?
Part of it was injury and just kind of my
Mhm.
body changing.
Mhm.
I had a series of small injuries that all kind of compounded when I was around 13, 14. Some
Mhm.
of them related to dance, some of them just related to regular life stuff. And I also, again, I'm the child of a nurse. So the attitude at home was that I should walk it off, which only made things worse, which,
Sure.
on the flip side, I'm like, yeah, pretty good advice in most situations, except for this time, right? So when
Mhm.
I was 16, I had to have my knees reconstructed,
Oh gosh.
back to back. So kind of like a lot of my high school years, and sometimes I casually mention this, but I was like, oh, I was on crutches or in a wheelchair for a lot of it, which
Oof.
was purely kind of like dealing with these injuries, which,
Mhm.
again, like for me, I'm very comfortable with a sense of inflated stakes. So it really never felt all that outrageous to me. It was like, oh,
Mm.
yeah, of course, this is what I'm doing.
Mhm.
Uh, and so a combination of kind of injury, but also I think I always had a variety of interests in performance. And I think speaking on stage is always something that was important to me, and that I kind of did a lot growing up too. I was performing in plays and other things. And again, went to this crazy Christian school that did a lot of damage, but also gave me a lot of opportunity. And starting in high school, the director of the drama program, who is a pastor, of course, and we only did missionary plays, these like horrific colonizing stories of like mid 20th century missionaries, like
Oof.
destroying communities and bringing people to the Lord. So that's all the shows that we were doing. And so I had a lot of opportunity to kind of step up and flex my muscles as a theater maker. And even
Mhm.
though it was in this like really broken environment, and the theater was not good, and the stories were A, aesthetically not good, and B, kind of socially destructive, it
Mhm.
gave me an opportunity to understand a little bit more about peer-to-peer direction, about how theater is made, about casting a show. It really was like kind of my laboratory. And I was the classic overachiever in high school.
Mhm.
So I was really trusted to do a lot of that. And now I look back at all the things that I did in high school and was constantly in trouble because I'm quite flamboyant, and that never sat well with anybody. Um,
Mm.
so, looking back at like a constant conflict with my teachers, but also an amazing amount of trust. And it gave
Mhm.
me a really like deep well of experience in making theater, especially in a peer to peer environment. And then that kind
Mhm.
of launched forward. And as I realized that like I didn't really want to be a professional dancer,
Mhm.
I still dance. It's like part of my shows. You got a little flavor of that in Schlong Song. It's not my danciest show, but I still,
Mhm.
I work as a choreographer. I dance a lot now. Um, I am very physically active all the time, so that's like a constant part of my life and my family. But it's not a career path that I'm interested in pursuing in that specified regard. So once I
Mhm.
got into high school, I was like, oh, theater is where it's at for me. And I also was playing a lot of music in high school. I was the pianist for all the choirs and for the orchestras and for our church. And so there was kind of this expectation that I would go to a really scary Bible college called Bob Jones University.
Oh, I'm
And
familiar with Bob
I'm
Jones.
sure you are. Anybody who's familiar with Bob Jones like knows exactly what my tone of voice is all about. And I like grew up going there like 3 times a year for American Association of Christian School competitions and everything. Like I had a high exposure to environments like Bob Jones. So
Mhm.
the expectation was that I was going to go to BJU and that I was going to become a choir director in some church. And during all of this, throughout my high school experience, I was in conversion therapy as well, starting at the age of
Oh
11.
shit.
So I went through basically 7 years of conversion therapy, and knew along through that process, through a lot of like bumps along the road, that I would never really be straight. I just assumed though that I would be able to get myself to neutral and just kind of resist any sexual contact, and
Mhm.
kind of exist as this like very approachable music teacher in some Christian school in the middle of the country. which I think is a pretty common experience for a lot of Christian people specifically who feel trapped, or conservative people who feel trapped in that identity. And that
So
was kind of the
yeah.
plan.
It's so interesting because like the way you describe this, you sound so kind of like at peace with it in some ways,
Mm,
but at the
mm.
same time, like what you're describing sounds like incredibly traumatic shit. Like, I mean, did you have a sense of self throughout this, knowing that like your inner sense of truth, or did you feel like you kind of just were playing, or like you were playing along? Like, what was your emotion throughout all of this about your sense of self?
Yeah, it was up and down, but mostly up, to be honest
Mm.
with you.
Mm-hmm.
Partially due to my personality, partially due to what my family was dealing with. You know, my dad's a sexual offender, and
Mm.
so there was a constant dialogue in my home about what my dad was up to, who he was aggressing,
Oh
what we
wow.
could do about it. Yeah, it was very uncommon for a religious family, and I feel it did it again. It distracted me a lot from other things, and it became I had to grow up really quickly in a
Mm.
lot of ways. But on the, with distance, I'm really thankful for that open dialogue, because I think the alternative would have been way worse for me,
Right.
and
Yeah.
especially because I'm a
Mm-hmm.
verbal processor, as you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really thankful that I kind of gained those muscles really early, where I'm like, this is really ugly and horrifying. Let's get it out in the open and let's yell at each other. I
Wow.
wish that there had been way more productive outcomes of that processing, but we were constantly processing my dad and the trauma that he was inflicting on us as a family, but also other people. So one of the trickiest like balancing acts of my high school experience was constantly being told that my situation as an obviously flamboyant person who had sexual urges for men but had never acted on them was
Mhm.
on the same par as my dad being this really affable sexual predator who was going after 12-year-old girls, and
Whoa.
being constantly told that those two things were equatable and that they were equal experiences, and that if I wanted forgiveness for being a dirty rotten sinner, then like I needed to extend that to my dad. And in retrospect, like that is one of the most destructive processes of thinking that really took me a long time to shake, was this idea that like, that if I want people to accept me, then I need to accept him, which is
Mhm.
not how it works at all. And so
Right.
I think in high school, I was really beleaguered with that idea and would constantly go back and forth. Anybody who comes from a religious background, there's those moments where you like really, really believe it. And then there's moments
Mhm.
where you're like, this is fucking crazy. This is
Mhm.
nuts. And so I was constantly kind of on that back and forth of like purging all the weird things that I had collected. Like I would collect dirty underwear from the locker room at school, and I was
Mhm.
like making my own porn and just really compulsive behavior. And then I
Mhm.
would like, have a crisis of conscience, and I would like throw it all away in the dumpster and start again, right? And like
Mhm.
rededicate myself to Christ over and over and over again. And then that process sort of slowed down as I got older. And I
Mhm.
started seeing that like no matter how many times I repented or my dad repented, like his behavior wasn't changing and my feelings weren't changing,
Mhm.
which again were two different situations but were happening at the same time. So it was like, oh, if he's not changing because he doesn't want to, I'm not changing because I can't.
Right.
And that gave me a lot of insight into the complexity of sexuality in general, but specifically against about diversity and sexuality from the heteronormative push. And
Mhm.
so once I started, and really like that secret relationship I'm very cavalier about, but I entered into it with a lot of nervousness and a lot of trepidation and a lot of fear that I would be exposed and rot in hell. But as soon as like honestly, as soon as I had my first sexual experience with that guy, I was like,
Mhm.
oh yeah, it's done. It's on. I'm into this in
Mhm.
every way, like sexually and emotionally and psychologically. And I can see that this is important to me, and I
Mm.
can't live as a church organist somewhere and ignore this part of myself,
Interesting.
because it just is too important. So by the time I hit 17, I was like, yeah, this is crazy. And I really had gone into this idea that like I was going to go to public school, I was going to go to conservatory for college, and I was going
Mhm.
to go to school for theater and dance, and I was going to be an artist, what I'm doing now. And
Mhm.
I faced a lot of resistance to that, obviously. And honestly, it wasn't until I talked to an older artist who had kind of grown up in a very similar environment to me, who had some connections to my childhood locales, like my school and my church.
Mhm.
And I sat down with him, gay man, and I was explaining to him what I was going through, and he's like, "Yeah, though, have you ever considered that like maybe God isn't real?" And I, up to that point, had never even given myself permission to actually consider that question.
Wow.
So that kind of again changed the game where I was like, oh my God, all of this is arbitrary. It's arbitrary, like
Yeah.
rather than feeling like God is real and I'm going to disappoint him forever, I switched into this like, this is bonkers. And like now I'm squarely like a very skeptical agnostic where I'm like, I
Mhm.
know that scientifically I can't prove the existence of God. I just highly doubt it. And that's my personal
Mhm.
perspective. But regardless of whether God is real, like I'm not interested in shaping my behavior in any particular way for something that I doubt, So I think at that point, it really gave me permission to shake off the last remnants of that, those spider webs in my own mind and
Sure.
grow into this like, who fucking cares? Get out of here. And thankfully, at that time too, my family stopped going to church entirely, which was
Oh, wow.
another weird, as impulsively as they started going to the church when I graduated. And it was like the night of my graduation, my mom was like, oh yeah, we're going to pull your sisters out and send them to public school, which I had begged for, of course,
Mm.
growing up, that I was like, please send me. We had a really normal public school down the street,
Mhm.
like really close, and they were like, no, 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 you have to serve the Lord or whatever. And then
Mhm.
I graduated, and my younger sisters like graduated from regular public high school and had really normal experiences, and I have
Mhm.
my younger sister has since come out as queer and is swimming in this like really beautiful development of her sexuality, and I'm like
Mm.
so jazzed to see that, right? Because for a lot, I have 4 siblings, and I was like,
Mhm.
statistically it's unlikely that I'm the only one, but I guess I
Mhm.
am. And that's been recent, for her in the last couple of years. And I'm like so pumped to have
Mm.
a queer sibling, and
Yay.
I know I'm like, yes, cool. Cause I have so many friends, right, that have like gay brothers or they're
Yeah.
twins and they're both gay or whatever. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that sounds so cool. And obviously, like my sister and I are exploring different parts of our sexuality. So like our experiences aren't the same, but they are so relatable and just kind of expanding our own view of ourselves. And
Mhm.
thankfully, my dad's out of the picture, and my mom is such a lovely wackadoo that she doesn't care. You know what I mean? Like she stopped caring entirely.
Mhm.
So about anything except for like keeping herself alive, which was like something that she had to focus on a lot when I was growing up and her whole life. And so
Mhm.
now, like, she's doing her own thing. All
Yeah.
my other siblings are doing their own thing. Like, no one cares anymore. So I think I would, again, have a very more hands-on approach to the kind of havoc that the church wreaked for me
Mhm.
if I still had people inside of it that I had to deal with. I'm
Sure.
thankful that I get a lot of space from that now.
Oh, that's great. Well, I also wonder, I mean, being in Atlantic City, it's such an interesting, like, I grew up in Ohio, and so like the nearest
Mm,
big city was Cleveland, which was 45 minutes
right.
away. And so like I certainly didn't grow up in a religiously oppressive environment like you, but I definitely felt like I was geographically isolated from, the capital A arts in some ways.
Yeah.
So it's like
Yeah.
you were so close to New York City, but you're so far away in experience. Did you feel like there was a place for you with queer bars and professional dancing and all this, or did it not even enter into your perspective?
No, it felt like so attainable. It felt like just around the river bend at all times,
Mm,
and I think that has been a defining attitude in my professional career, that it's just always felt uh like I don't have any other option, and not
mhm,
and not in a way that makes me feel like, well, that I'm destined for this or I'm
mhm,
destined for that. It's just like, no, this is what I do, and this is what I have always done and what I will always do. And of course that will change and grow, and I will add new things to that toolkit. But
mhm.
even as a kid at 5, I was convinced that like I will do this forever. And so far it's been true for 25 years.
That's
And
amazing. That
yeah,
tenacity is
I'm
so interesting because, like, I feel like again, like it could have been the thing that was beaten out of you from all of
right,
these oppressive places, but you
right.
just felt like you had this inner sense of truth. Like, I mean, even talking about doing the mission plays, where it's like you were still making your own art, even if it wasn't.
Yeah,
That's a really interesting thing for a young person to take on.
right.
So many of us often look to other adults to like tell us what to do around making things. But the
Mhm.
fact that you kind of took it on, you're like, I'm going to do this, yeah, pure direction stuff. Like that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I have one I have all the empathy for people and my friends and my close collaborators, right, who describe these feelings of like, I don't know if I'm supposed to make art anymore. I don't know this or that or whatever about their artistic career, and I can only like extend my psychological empathy to that, but I like have truly never experienced that within myself. And
Mhm.
so I understand, I felt that way about other things in my life where I'm like, oh, I have to let go of this thing that I thought was really important to me.
Mhm.
But making art as a professional has never really been one of those things. And,
Mhm.
who knows, life is long and things change, but,
Yeah.
it hasn't changed so far. So it feels like, and not to say that it's not constant work or labor, or that I enjoy every second of, being a working artist.
Mhm.
Because there's a lot of it that sucks,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
that's part of the deal. It's
Yeah.
part of the career, and I think part of what really gave that to me is my mom is a career nurse, and a very decorated and accomplished nurse, and
Mhm.
um, a nurse who takes pride in being renowned in her field. She's a birthing specialist, so she works in maternity and has for a long time, and in the same hospital for almost 40 years.
Mm.
And it was always like, you got the impression growing up, even as her kid, who she clearly loved us and is a great mom now and was then, with a lot of like asterisks put by different things, right?
Mhm.
But like, always what was apparent is that she loved working, and she instilled that sense of like, who cares what you're doing, just work, and I
Mhm.
understand that that's like maybe connected to a lot more complicated ideas of like generational value systems and maybe capitalism, but
Mhm.
I have that really deeply ingrained in me, that idea of like, work, just work, and work at
Mhm.
something that you love deeply, and that will balance the effort of that work, right? And I've seen my mom consistently, like, and through multiple nervous breakdowns and complete crises of her personality, and kind of shatter into pieces, but never lose that identity of like, I'm a nurse and I'm a great nurse and I love being a nurse.
Mm.
And I think that's really applied, that's transferred to me, um, in a way that I'm so thankful for. Like,
Yeah.
at any given point that I feel like I'm crumbling in other ways, like, well, I'm a performer, and this is what I do, and this is constantly what I'm doing, and crafting new ways to do that. So
Mhm.
I think a lot of that was my mom, and the contrast of my dad never really having a stable job, never really having a career. He was a dabbler, master of or jack of all trades, master of none.
Mhm.
So I got to see that high contrast of my mom being a highly accomplished professional and dedicated to a craft, and my dad being like a complete freeloader. I was like,
Mhm.
ooh, which of these is more resonant to me? Like,
Yeah.
definitely the former.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your shows then,
Mm.
because I mean, I again like the idea of doing a one person show. I mean, you're writing it. Did you have a director? Did you kind of direct it yourself too?
That show, I do not have a director. That's on.
Okay, so you're
That's on.
basically just like, I'm gonna do a thing.
Yeah.
So, like that, and so the Schlong song itself, it's interesting because like the one thing that I'm remembering now as I'm thinking about it was kind of contrasting with you're talking about your body as a ballet dancer, because you definitely get naked a couple times as you do some
Mm-hmm.
costume changes. You're wearing these booty shorts, and at one point I think your nuts were starting to fall out of your
Oh
shorts,
yeah. Oh
and it was
yeah.
just a moment where I'm like, as a watch, I'm like, I think he knows that that's happening, and I think he doesn't care, and it was a beautiful moment because you're doing like jazzercise, and I'm like, huh, this is kind of lovely, because there really did feel like this, like Woody's just kind of, it's basically, it felt like a very beautiful like mix of voyeurism, where it's like I'm just watching somebody who might be doing this in their bedroom, but they're doing it on
Yeah. Oh.
stage. And it was a very fun, like kind of light way to experience somebody's kind of truest expression of movement and kind of ebullient goofy joy.
I that is so meaningful to me. Thank you for phrasing it in that way.
Oh,
I'm working on another show right now where the driving aesthetic force is to mirror the shows that I made in my bedroom when I was 10 years old and would force my
yeah.
parents to watch. So thank you. I always want that vibe on stage, that like, clearly I'm a crafted professional, but like, I still want it to feel like you're watching something, really personal and
Yeah.
very like, should I be watching this? And in fact, one of my like go-to jokes is constantly being like, not unaware of my own exposure, but like,
Mhm,
to Maria Bamford, who is a comedian I deeply
mhm,
respect and
mhm,
is really important to me, references in like the most recent season of her show Lady Dynamite. There's a scene where she's completely naked, and
mhm,
it's completely non-sexual. It's just this like really funny joke, and she talked about in an interview just how important it was for her to make jokes about about nudity that weren't explicitly sexual,
mhm,
right? And I think I had some of that feeling before, but kind of hearing a comedian I respect kind of clarify that point gave me a lot of things to grasp. Where and maybe I think you expressed part of that, right? Is that like
Mhm.
not all the times I get naked in Schlong Song are sexual. Some of them were, but a
Mhm.
lot of them are just like really casually me like just getting naked, which is kind of how I live my life. I am notoriously naked. Um, with like, I strive always to create like a consensual environment around that, but
Mhm.
I'm very interested in the relationship of nudity to sex and kind of how that relates to a story. But um,
Yeah.
in that show, I now, it's not as if a switch were flipped, but as I grew older, I just kind of like, maybe a switch was flipped, and I was like, you know what, I love being naked. I love dressing like a 13-year-old runaway, um and forcing that out into a space. And as I craft that, and as I've crafted that for the last 10 years as a professional identity and kind of this onstage shtick, I've come to realize a lot of the complexity of that around gender presentation and around the politicizing of different identities, right? And
Mhm.
the fact that like I wear slutty clothes, period, but a lot of
Mhm.
the clothes I wear are more typically seen on female identified people.
Mhm.
And so I find that I prompt a very different reaction being like a pretty male bodied looking person,
Mhm.
with a mustache and a mullet and muscles and a hairy chest. Like I get a very different reaction out of wearing like Daisy Dukes and a spaghetti string tank top
Mhm.
than I think a female bodied person would.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm really interested in playfully poking holes in those assumptions about who wears what on stage and
Mhm.
why. And I mentioned this in Schlong Song that my wardrobe really serves very specific functions. Um, some of them practical. I just like dressing that way, but also it does create an environment around me where I can really quickly figure out where people stand in relationship
Mm.
to me and to open queerness, right?
Yeah.
Like I can tell really quickly who's an ally, who's an asset, and who's going to make an awkward pass. So
Mhm.
it gives me a lot of bargaining power very quickly, and I can
Mm.
very quickly sort through people and just be like, yeah, you don't deserve my time. You don't understand what I'm about, but you probably would if I talked to you. Or like, hey, what's up? I see you eyeing me. Let's talk. Let's
Mhm.
smash. So like I value that piece, but it's also, it's given me a lot of pushback in a lot of environments too. And I'm
Sure.
constantly interested in deconstructing um, the respectability politics,
Mhm.
and kind of getting back to the point of where sex and sexuality can confront power and privilege, and really get to the bottom of like all of the baggage we have wrapped up around those points.
That's so interesting because I think one of the bits that I liked the most about Schlong Song was you talking about the steam room.
Mm,
Because you share a story about you kind of eye fucking or flirting with this other guy in a steam room, and there's a straight man who walks in, and and the vibe immediately shifts. I think if I'm remembering this correctly, and you kind of go on a little beautiful rant about how you're like, no, this is our space, like we get to
right,
have this eye fuckery. we're not
right,
we're not interlopers, you're the interloper straight guy.
right,
And it was a
right,
beautiful moment because I could feel the audience kind of align themselves in those categories that you just described, of like the people who are get it, the people who wish they could get it, the people who are finding themselves confronted by your rant. And it was a
mm-hmm,
really nice moment of suddenly knowing from this one anecdote where people really feel where people's privileges are invisible to them, where they believe that
right,
they get to have every space that they think they should get, and
right.
also the kind of radical resistant power of queer fuckery,
That's right.
and of declaring that this space is a queer fuckery space.
That's right.
I thought that was really
And
cool to see.
thank you. Thank you. It's really important to me in all of my work, and Schlong Song, it comes up a lot, but the idea that like gayness and queerness as different things, but also related,
Mhm.
they're cultural. They're not
Mhm.
merely transactional. They're not merely based in sexual action.
Mhm.
They are a state of mind. They are a perspective, and they are shaped by visionary community leaders who have contributed to them since time memoriam. Right, like
Mhm.
the development of our contemporary queer identity comes from you know human existence,
Mhm.
and the development of human sexuality and thought, and pushback against conservative ideas and really destructive ideas. But I, as a queer person, right, like sometimes I thought of it the other day and it's probably not articulate yet, but I'm trying to put it into a show. But the idea that like the fact that I want to suck dick all the time makes me gay. But the fact that I like want to do it in a public park makes me queer. Right. Like,
Oh, I
and
like that.
thank you. And, you know, and we all have different relationships to that, right? Where like we can access the cultural touchstones of our community and how our communities intersect. And, you know, if I want to signal, part of the reason I have a mullet and a mustache is because I want to carry forth the legacy of men at different points in history that, you know, wore those as identifiers and as markers of
Mhm.
themselves, and to reclaim this identity. And, you know, I wear a lot of like aviator reader glasses. You know, I look like a gay man from 1979,
Mhm.
and that's really important to me to kind of carry on that legacy, but also to kind of prompt people's opinions of those things and to challenge them in a different space. You know, I've worked
Mhm.
in education a long time, and sometimes people are surprised to hear that, especially because I'm really raunchy on stage
Mhm.
on purpose, and I'm a raunchy
Mhm.
person. But I don't think that that conflicts with the idea of educating anyone, specifically young people. You know, I think
Sure.
there's a really ethical way to educate your community about sex while also being like a supportive member of younger folks or whatever. But,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, I worked in a preschool for a while, and it was an amazing preschool with a really supportive staff, but I definitely, you know, was constantly pushing up against that with parents, right? Because I'm clearly gay. You can visually clock me. I have
Mhm.
a lisp, I have a mustache, I have a mullet, and I don't wear very traditional clothing. So
Mhm.
like I clearly was in an environment where it's like, oh, you think I'm gonna hurt your kid?
Mhm.
Okay, cool. And being, again, that comes down to that presentation piece, but like constantly being able to confront that prejudice and be like, no,
Mhm.
I'm actually one of the more capable teachers at this school, regardless of my sexuality. So, you know, let me use my superpower of communication to talk you out of your own bias,
Right.
or to at least turn you around 180 so that you have to look at your own bias in the face and go home and deal with that. Because
Right.
it's not always my job to educate you. Right. It's sometimes just my job to like put it in front of you and be like, deal with this, read a book. I don't know what
Well,
to
yeah,
tell you.
it speaks to this interesting, like, kind of. I mean, it's been a conversation for as long as I can remember, but the idea of like homonormativity, where it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea that queer, like that gay rights, like the thing that gay rights needed to accomplish was marriage, and then we got that, and now we're
Yeah.
done, right?
Yeah.
And I understand like there are some people who just do want to get married and wear Dockers and have a nice house in the suburbs and live the very normative life, but they want to do it with their husband instead of a wife. I understand
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think that they should have the right to do that. But I do think it's important to tease out those distinctions of like
Yes.
queerness and of subversion and of
Yes.
non-normativity, regardless of necessarily what you're packing in your panties. Like it's about like
Right.
how we relate to sex and how we relate to our bodies and how we relate to other
Right.
people. And that to me is an interesting. It's important to, I think, to tease out those differences, to say like, yes, there are some people who want this, but there are a lot of other people who think that actually the very nature of the way we talk about sexuality in our society is the thing that's borked. It's not about
Yes.
two men, it's about actually bodies in general.
Correct. And I, so beautifully put. And I often am thinking a lot in those environments because I'm confronted with that. I work as a stripper and I work on Capitol Hill, which is rapidly changing.
Mm.
Um, and has been for some time. I'm not like new to experience that, but you know, I'm constantly confronted by that like Docker and gingham reality, both in the straight people that are coming in, but also the like gay people that want to live a different lifestyle than mine.
Mm.
And I, again, have like logical empathy for that. And I would never stand in somebody's way of actuating the kind of life that they want. But I will continually and antagonistically encourage them to think about the basis of those thoughts and where that idea actually came from. I'm
Mhm.
very suspicious of where that idea that like that's the way to have a happy identity actually came from, right?
Mm. Mhm.
For anybody, for straight people too, like in general, like to my eyes, that's a marketing ploy from 1955. You know, so like I'm very suspicious of that. And it's not, again, I don't want to stand in anyone's way of actuating that for themselves.
Mhm.
Similar, that's like similarly how I feel to kids. I love kids. I've worked with them my whole life. I'm not going to have any because I don't believe in it for a lot of reasons. But like,
Mhm.
you know, any, especially like queer people, right, who like kind of want to make a more normative family, they have every right to do so. But I'm continually suspicious of like where that idea first came from and what they're actually striving for in actuating that lifestyle.
Mhm.
um, and not suspicious in a way that should, that should shut it down entirely. I don't think that it should disappear. I just would like to see a little bit more thoughtfulness about like, why does that feel important? Is it because like you work at a tech company and if you don't fulfill those expectations, you won't be seen as an equal in your workplace?
Mm-hmm.
Then to me as a queer activist, I'm like, cool, let's change your workplace. Right. Rather than kind of put on all these trappings of like normativity,
mm-hmm.
specifically heteronormativity. I'm like, the root cause seems to be something entirely different. So rather than treat the symptom, let's treat the cause.
Sure. I mean, that's something I think about because, like, as a sex educator, I teach a class on polyamory, and often I will say, like, monogamy is a perfectly legitimate choice as long as it's a choice. But it's so default in our culture. So many people take it for granted and they assume all these things about monogamy being the only option. So they never even think of it as just one of many options. And the same thing with kids. And I think that it's for me, like, and then maybe this is also like through my very Western American lens, this very privileged lens of like, I believe that we should be able to interrogate the places where we just take these things for granted as though they are the way, capital H humans are. And that's just not the case. And I feel like that's what queerness gave me, was interrogation of all these things that we just thought were the ways that we had to be. And to actually kind of open that door to Oz and say like, hey, actually, you got a lot more other options, and you should be able to have the opportunity to step into those things should they be the right choice for you.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's all like wrapped into this idea of exploring queerness as a larger umbrella and as a larger idea, and less related to like any one particular sexual impulse that I might feel 50 times a day, mapping those things and creating a constellation of thought and of history, and really recognizing like, what are my implicit biases? What are my points of privilege that I am unable to see through? Like I can't see the forest through the trees in those things, right? And working in gay bars and working around a lot of capital G gay people, I'm constantly confronted by that, right? Of like, I'm a gold star gay because I've never fucked a woman, or like, ew, boobies are gross, or whatever, right? Like, and the list goes on, and I forever will know that gay white men specifically can be some of the worst people on the planet. Merely because they're like, well, haven't I had it hard enough? I'm not going to think about everything anymore, which is just so lazy to me. And I can abide a lot of things except for laziness. So constantly being confronting that in a space, but also figuring out where at different points in my history, I've held those ideas, not necessarily because they were my ideas, but because I inherited them. Right. And as you put, right, interrogating those points of privilege and of assumption and of bias, and saying like, actually, do I think that? And what's been really exciting to me in the last like 5-6 years or so, like part of my Seattle experience has been kind of broadening my idea of sexuality. And like recently I've been watching a lot of straight porn. And I'm like, oh, I'm so into this, and like being really excited as a person who's like been, a longtime consumer of porn, constantly being like, wow, I can feel my brain expanding. I can feel my mind expanding and my sexuality expanding, and not really that it's going to like radically shift who I have sex with or how I have sex, but like, again, creating amazing skills for empathy. And something that is the core value of Swan Song, is that experimentation ups your empathy levels across the board, right? All kinds of experimentation. For me, that's sexual, but in general, trying new things gives you, new basis for comparison. And so even in my indirect ways, I'm like, oh man, look at all these new frontiers that I have to explore. It's an endless process. It's a lifelong process. And I'm so excited by that. And having a show like Swan Song and taking it on the road and performing it around the country gives me an opportunity to really carry that torch forward, and something that I joke about in the show, and kind of like one of my more famous bits is that I'm a bro whisperer, that just kind of specifically like bro-y straight dudes like find me from all over and just come to me for like sexual exploration, which like on a personal libidinal level, I'm like so here for. On a political level, I'm like a little more thoughtful about now than I used to be, but I'm definitely like, yeah, I'll totally give you the best blowjob of your life. And I hope it haunts you forever, may you never forget this, but now as I start to travel more and more, it becomes more important for for me to share that story. And every time I perform the show, I have a straight dude who's like very content in his straight identity come up to me and say like, hey, you really gave me a lot to think about, right?
Mm.
Which to me, my selfish response is like, cool, let's shack up. But on a psychological level, my work is done. Like
Yeah.
that's the first step, right? And the reality, and you know this as a sex educator and as an artist, the reality is that like it's highly unlikely that any one person is going to in interpersonal work like going to plant the seed, water the seed, and reap the fruit
Mhm.
in one lifetime or with
Mhm.
one relationship, right? Like
Mhm.
that's a rarity that you get to see that amount of growth constantly in sex. I think it's little drops, right? And
Mhm.
it's a gradual process, and through a lifetime of experience you tend to learn more things about yourself and about power systems and about politics and about your own sexuality. But that's like such a gradual thing, right? Like
Mhm.
in Swan Song, I tell a really specific story of having a great hookup with a straight friend who then turned out to be a real douchebag.
Mm.
And I had to let go of the idea that like I was going to be the one to show him that he was a douchebag. And now
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I am one more mark on the chalkboard that's going to lead him to that assumption, right?
That's
Like
such a
he's going to
magnanimous way of
discover that.
approaching that, though. Like, that's so generous of spirit. I feel like I get definitely attached to these ideas of like, why can't you have your epiphany now with me? Why
Yes.
can't I have
Yes.
the great you that you're going to be once you figure this shit out? Because I
Right.
want that you, but that's the you that
Ugh.
I might have to say goodbye to, and never, and
Ugh.
that you'll give that to somebody else, and
Right. Ain't
ugh,
that the truth? Ooh.
ugh, it
Ooh, that's one of
hurts.
the reasons I don't date because I have a really I can do that in the abstract, and then I've only dated 2.5 people in my life. One of them was fairly recent and an amazing person,
Mm,
but there was a lot of growth happening for both of us, and a
mm.
lot of growth specifically that they shared with me after they dumped me twice in a coffee shop, in the same coffee shop, mind you,
Jesus.
in the same year. They shared with me that like, wow, you helped me learn a lot of lessons, and now I'm seeing them enact those lessons in other places with other people, and it's on a
Uh,
personal level really hard for me to be
yeah,
gracious about that.
sure.
On a psychological level, though, I'm like, no, that's important. That's how it
Yeah,
works,
but that's like your saintly
And
place. You're like, ah, yes,
right,
Saint
right.
Saint
Well, and
Woody
that's
can
like,
think that. Yeah,
oh, that's a tie over of my religious upbringing, right? That I'm like,
yeah.
you can't. It's a community effort, right? It's a lifelong reaping. We're bringing in the
Mm-hmm.
sheaves, which is terrible, but and that's in general, and it's been curious living in a like highly quotation marked progressive city of
Mm-hmm.
Seattle and of the Northwest, with like all of the understanding of the loaded
Mm-hmm.
attitude of that word and that idea, but realizing that I have an amazing community here. I have people that I love and respect as humans and as artists. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, like this is not my market, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
not the environment that I'm creating for, and this is not the reach that I'm intending to have with my career and
Mm-hmm.
the shit that I talk about. And so actively, and this coming year, this 2019, there are a lot of opportunities for me that I can't announce yet, but can
Ooh.
soon. How's that for a teaser? But there are things cooking for me that will enable me to work in environments that I think need a little bit more exposure, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding that like sometimes the attitude that gets me through is that you can't be it if you can't see it.
Mm.
And working in especially parts of our country and more broken parts of our country, and being a very openly culturally queer person and talking about sex and wearing slutty shorts and having my nuts pop out, and
Mm-hmm.
also being a comedian and teaching high schoolers and whatever, like the complexity of me as a person, um, there's importance in that visibility, right? And like I dream of working in colleges and universities in middle America.
Mm-hmm.
I dream of working with students in environments that they don't have access to queer people or to the arts or to thoughtful political comedy or anything,
Mm-hmm.
and those are the people who really need these stories. And I think that what we're discovering in our country, especially as like art makers, is that the old narrative was that if your conservative environment, your Ohio or New Jersey environment doesn't suit you, flee to a coastal city,
Mm-hmm.
surround yourself with like-minded people, and you'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Which in many cases is the truth, right? We all
Mm-hmm.
have like really complex but thriving lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen is that thoughtful people have kind of abandoned parts of the country,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're reaping the impact of that, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
looking back and we're like, oh, why why are there these currents of ignorance and currents of hate?
Yeah.
It's because people who were interested in instigating thought around those ideas left them.
Yeah.
And I have done a lot. My mind has changed a lot in my life about like why somebody would stay in a small town or a
Mm-hmm.
conservative environment or, XYZ. And I've grown in a lot of understanding as to like, oh, some people stay here because they like it, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
some people people live in Oklahoma because they love Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and that is their right,
Mm-hmm.
and like how dare I, as a bi-coastal person fleeing to, again, like a quote progressive city,
Mm-hmm.
pass judgment on that idea, right?
Yeah.
What I believe I should do and what I can do is continually, spark conversation and dialogue and connection with those places, and make sure that like we're not losing touch of each other's biases, right? Like,
Right.
because that's my implicit bias, that like you're an ignorant redneck, which is not true of
Mm-hmm.
most people in
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma or anywhere, right? And vice versa, like you're a militant, gay activist or whatever, which is true, but
Mm-hmm.
also like they have a misunderstanding of that identity. So
Sure.
that cultural exchange is so key for me, and really like what I'm thirsting for in this next
Mm-hmm.
phase of my career. And thankfully, I'm finding opportunities to kind of carry that forward, and I'm more and more excited to kind of craft those identities and not just be an artist who can consistently sell out a particular Seattle house,
Right.
but do, to me, what seems like the harder task, which is like drift into uncharted territory and unsupportive territory in a lot of cases,
Mm-hmm.
and recognize that there's a lot to be gained there. I
Yeah.
taught for a while with Missoula Children's Theater on tour, and the main purpose of that tour specifically is to send two professional actors into rural communities and help
Hmm.
create community theater with the children in that community, and then they perform it for their community at the end of the week. And that experience, more than any other, completely exploded my worldview and my
Mm-hmm.
idea of who people are and what people are.
Mm-hmm.
And and that was almost 10 years ago now, and now I'm like, oh, the perpetual cycle of growth. Like I want to be this version of myself and go talk to those people.
Mm-hmm. Ugh. Woody, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and I want to keep talking to you, but we're running out of time. So
Mm,
thank you for all of this. You are a brilliant delight. Where can people find you if they want to figure out where you're performing or hire you for their
yeah.
college or whatever?
Yeah, please bring me to you. My website is
Mhm.
www.woodyshticks.com. I also post a lot of nudes on Instagram. Uh, and upcoming, the projects that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about, in February 7th through the 10th in Seattle at 18th and Union in the Central District, I will be producing a queer comedy mini fest called Tender Loving Queers. So it's
Mm,
4 days, 7 shows of all queer comedians performing primarily stand up, but a variety of different things. One show is pro comedians, another show is students, high school and college students doing their first ever stand up set. And me and my favorite comedians are workshopping their material with them. We'll
mhm.
have an afternoon potluck story slam for one of the shows. And then every night of that mini fest, I'll be performing my brand new solo called Who Cares? Which is an unlikely comedy quest into the void to figure out what's on the other side of identity politics.
Brilliant. Well, Woody
Mm.
Shticks, thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolute delight. You're wonderful. I'm glad to know you.
Allison, you are a gem, and I'm thankful for your contributions to our community and for this really thoughtful conversation. I appreciate you.
Yay! Awesome. And that's it for this week's episode of Artgasm. Thank you, as always, for joining me. If you want to learn more about Woody and see him live, please go to his website, woodyshticks.com. If you want to support me and this podcast, well, first of all, thank you. And also, the best way to do that is by going to our Patreon and supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/artgasm. And there you can get special bonus episodes, special longer episodes, a lot of fun extra goodies, and you get to know that you're helping support this labor of love of mine. And again, if you want to see me perform at the Mystery Box, go to mysteryboxshow.com. And of course, please do subscribe, please do share. I've got a lot of really great episodes coming up in the next couple of weeks, so please go visit the website and become a subscriber in all the various ways. You can see them right on the top of the website, artgasmcast.com. You can become a subscriber at Apple Podcasts, at Spotify, on Stitcher, all the places, all the places. So go become a subscriber and leave a review and support us on Patreon and do all the wonderful things that help me know that what I'm doing is what you're liking. In the meantime, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.